Welcome, everyone. Here we are for this beautiful fireside chat. If we're not prepared to govern, we're not prepared to win. And let's get into the juicy stuff. So yeah, I'm really grateful to be here with all of y'all, this rad group of folks, to hold this conversation in public that I've been hearing happening within many movement organizations in the past decade. So just for a little grounding, as our event title says, when Movement First Generation first came out with their Just Transition framework, and we'll drop a link to that framework in the chat, one of the core principles of the framework was, if we're not prepared to govern, we're not prepared to win. And many movement organizations have heard this call, and in the last decade and even longer, have more and more have started to practice forms of liberatory governance and self-management within their own organizations. And so we're here to talk more about what this process is teaching us as organizations committed to changing more than just our workplaces, but all of society. So let's hear some introductions from our panelists. If each of you could please introduce yourself, tell us a little bit more about your organization, and then just give us a little teaser about why you think worker self-direction in our movement organizations matters. Why is it worth it? So I'll pass it over to Rachel Humphreys with Justice Funders to start us off.
Thanks so much, Nicole. Great to be with you all. I'm Rachel, she, her. I'm with Justice Funders. Justice Funders is a partner and guide for philanthropy to bring about the just transition. So we see ourselves as a political home for funder organizers, for those who are really working for that regenerative economy and seeing philanthropy as one way that we can get there. Why worker self-directed nonprofit? If we're asking the philanthropies to change how power happens and to shift all the things, we need to do so as well. So, just like Mark said in the chat, like, this is a site of practice for the world that we want. This is a chance to practice the fractal of the kinds of governance and ways of being that the world needs. So great to be with you all.
Thanks, Rachel. Good to hear from you. And pass it over to Yanni from Movement Sustainability Commons.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Yanni. I use she and they pronouns, and I am currently representing Movement Sustainability Commons today. We offer traditional and non-traditional, what the world kind of calls back-end services, but we call offerings, to nonprofits who are focused on social justice work in New England. So that includes fiscal sponsorship, fundraising support, a bookkeeping collective, access to spirituality and healing support for our movements, and creating regular opportunities for experimentation on what else we could offer and whatever's needed out in the field. And for me personally, as somebody who moved from on the ground organizing to philanthropy to now this like more nonprofit operations role, worker self-direction has been a real paradigm shift on my understanding on how power can and should move within and amongst nonprofits, pivoting from like the corporate structure that we inherited to something that's really generated for and by the people. Really excited to be here.
Thanks, Yanni. Great to hear from you. I'll pass it over to Ricardo from the Sustainable Economy Law Center.
Thanks, Nicole. Hi, everybody. I'm Ricardo Nunez from Sustainable Economies Law Center. We're based in Oakland, California, but we got staff all over the country. And I am actually not in the United States right now. I'm in Pátzcuaro, Michoacán in Mexico. There's some protests and street blockages happening down the street from my house. So everybody's coming down using my street as like a passway. So if there's some extra noise, that's where it's coming from. I think a little teaser about why I think worker self-direction in our movement organizations matters, that maybe hasn't been shared yet, because a lot of what was said resonated with me, is also just about the trade-offs that we're willing to take when we're practicing democracy in a deep way, like within our organizations. And so becoming more honest with ourselves about what we're actually asking of our communities and our comrades and our friends and society to do this shift. that we're advocating for. So that's what I'll say. Okay.
Thanks for that little teaser. And lastly, Ramiro Muria from the Post Landfill Action Network.
Hey everybody, well, pleasure to be here with you all. My name is Ramiro. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm here representing the Post Landfill Action Network. Plan works with students to equip them with the tools and resources necessary to holistically understand like the waste crisis and to be change leaders on their campus. So for us, when we talk about worker self-directed nonprofits and why we've deemed them as like important, for us it's kind of the example of like walking the walk that we keep, that what everyone is kind of echoing what everyone has said. This is the kind of changes that we're advocating for in every other space. Why shouldn't we be examples? So for us, like introducing it we work predominantly with college students, introducing it to them as soon as we can and being like, hey, like this is how we organize our organization, and showing them that they don't need to follow the traditional structures that are seen out there.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm excited to hear more from each of you as we get into this conversation. But last thing before we head there, this is a fireside chat, and we know there are tons of people in the room, names and faces I recognize, who have lots of experience with worker self-direction, and we want to be in a generative conversation all together. So before we open it up, we have a little Mentimeter for you all, just to get a sense of who's in the room and what kind of big questions we're holding and thoughts we have about this work together. So Mentimeter, if you're not familiar, is just kind of an interactive tool where we can ask a few questions and see the responses kind of live updated. So thank you, Sue, for dropping the link to the Mentimeter in the chat. The easiest thing is just to open that Mentimeter. You should see a question. Did you attend or watch part 1 of this series? Totally not necessary, but we're just curious who already has some of that background. So if you're able to share the screen with the Mentimeter, we can see the results live as they're filtering in. It looks like we're about split so far from folks we've heard of, 50-50. Oh yeah, that's a little QR code if you're having a hard time getting onto the Mentimeter. And if you can't get on, it's not a huge deal. It's just a quick kind of survey to see from who all is here. And as more answers filter in, it looks like, yeah, maybe a little more than half of us have not actually watched part 1, which is totally fine. Maybe that's just an opportunity for folks here to share a little bit more about your organizations. And we did have a link to the follow-up or the recording for the first webinar. So if you want to watch that recording, you can. All right. We do have a couple other questions for you. Let me get to my Mentimeter tab so I can move over to the next question. Let's see. So you might not have the right link there.
I'm right here.
Okay, great. Well, let's see. I'm not sure why exactly the second question isn't showing, but we could just see some quick responses in the chat from folks. Curious to hear, what's your relationship with worker self-directed nonprofits? So, is this the first time you're hearing about it and you're excited to learn more? Or do you work in a worker self-directed nonprofit? Or have you studied them a lot, but not actually seen them in practice? Share just a little bit in the chat with us about what your relationship is with, so we can get a sense of who's in the room. Yeah, seeing some people who want to learn how to build one and help others build one, that's awesome. some folks with some awesome experience, been part of building two, both Resist and the Movement Sustainability Commons, some folks who work at Worker Self-Directed, some that are in the very initial stages of building one. Awesome, great. So we have a good range of experience with what worker self-directed nonprofits are. And the last question we have for you, which is really going to just be an ongoing question, is like, what questions do you have about worker self-directed nonprofits? Keep these coming in. I see some folks saying they've never worked in a nonprofit, but have worked in a worker co-op. Interesting. There's connections, relationships between worker co-ops and worker self-directed nonprofits in terms of how they run. So we will, thanks for all these answers, everyone. Great to see who's here. Other folks who are working at worker self-directed, working in worker co-ops, and currently work in a non-democratic nonprofit. I'm sure we all have, many of us have experience with that as well. So last, as we move into some discussion and conversations together, please feel free to use the chat lively and generatively. If you have questions for the panelists, bring them in chat. We might invite you to come off mute and share your questions and be part of the conversation together. And we'll be doing our best to sort of curate those questions and bring them in. And we'll also be curating whatever resources come into the chat. So cool. Thanks everyone for sharing a little bit more about your relationship to these ideas and to this conversation series. It's great to get a little bit more of a sense of who all is in the room. So yeah, I wanted to open us up for this discussion. And our first question for you all is, what has the process of becoming a worker self-directed nonprofit taught you about what is needed in our movements and movement organizations to build the more beautiful world we dream is possible? So what are you learning? What are you learning about yourself? What are you learning about what's needed in movement spaces to build this more beautiful world? And Yanni, I'll pass it over to you to start us off and then invite anyone in to share.
Thanks, Nicole. So I'll respond from two angles. I mean, there's a lot that can be said about this question. But for me personally, I'm currently supporting the onboarding process of someone who is coming from a more traditional hierarchical nonprofit into the Commons. And we're having some like kind of mirrored experiences, me 5 years ago when I joined Resist and her now joining us, around being honest that there's as much there is learning about how to function in a worker self-directed nonprofit. There's a whole lot of unlearning and like realizing, oh, even the lenses in which I'm asking questions is coming from a hierarchical standpoint. And this is somebody who's like, I consider to be a movement elder, and to like watch this movement elder be like, whoa, I have not thought about structure in this way has been a real gift for me to be like, well, I guess we're now playing around with something different. So being honest around like that takes time, and that in our movements, we have so much valid need for urgency, and a lot of like constructive urgency that's not particularly helpful. And so how do we balance the reality that folks are coming into our organizations needing to absorb and let go of ways of being and thinking, while also needing and wanting to maintain a pace the organization moves in? I think the other thing I'll say on this is it really is highlighting for me the ways in which we, in various kinds of organizing contexts, are fighting for transparency and decision-making power, and yet our organizational structures don't reflect the ability to do that. And for a multitude of reasons, we silo what decisions can be made among some people and what decisions are made in others. And so I have felt really excited and also challenged by the ways in which transparency has pushed me to think about, okay, how is power actually moving in ways that I haven't even made space for myself to consider?
Can I jump in? Yeah. Thank you for sharing all that. It brought up a couple of things for me, and thinking about like the process of learning, the process of unlearning, and I think part of it is like, and I think you mentioned this of like we're just babies at this thing. We're just like, we're gonna make a lot of mistakes, and so a lot of the unlearning that I've done with myself, being at a worker self-directed nonprofit for over 11 years now, and with others at my organization, and the one others that I've seen and worked with that are WSDNs or worker co-ops practicing democratic governance and participatory management, is mm, understanding that inner critic that's coming up and telling us, oh, we need to do it this way, we need to frame it in a certain way, and we're being bad, or we're being not good, or whatever, when we make mistakes. And so there's a lot of, I think, a high level of like emotional intelligence, or like a request for more emotional intelligence in these spaces, which is a really difficult and something that we are not brought up in, that resources aren't given like toward. And so that's something else that's like coming up for me in this, like what's needed in our movements is both the ability to like be compassionate with ourselves, be compassionate with each other, and just like be more playful and allow ourselves to be more playful. Like why, what I've seen sometimes, and even with myself and my reactions to like budget decisions or strategy decisions or whatever, is like that old, the like hegemonic kind of like paradigm voice coming up and speaking through me, when that's the thing that I'm like fighting against. And so that's some of the stuff that I think that our movements can use, and I see it more and more, both as something for ourselves, in being compassionate with ourselves and each other, but also as we're moving through outward political activity, to like be more playful, so that we make this movement irresistible, and so that more people come in, and we're not continuing to be like marginal in the work that we do. So that's what's coming up for me with this question right now. Yeah, check.
I can hop in. Thank you both so much. Totally co-sign, agree, everything that you've shared for sure. And as I heard the question, what came to my mind is this balance of like at Justice Funders, and just shout out to got a couple of colleagues here with us, but we like to use this phrase of like holding the whole. So like building that like stance and ability to hold the whole as a member of a worker self-directed nonprofit, but then simultaneously actually being able to let go and to trust others in making decisions. Because, we're at like 18 staff, we're like not all gonna want to be on every decision, right? So I think that balance and the dance between those two is something that our movements need as well, to be able to build this beautiful world that we need. So.
Thanks, everyone. Ramiro, you want to add anything?
I mean, so Plan has had the wonderful opportunity we just converted to a worker self-directed nonprofit last year. We're actually coming up on a year here in June. So I've had the opportunity to see Plan function underneath your traditional executive director model, and then also seen it was part of the team that transitioned us over into worker self-directed. And I think for me, one of the most interesting things has been just, and this is something we've talked about before, where it's just how much more structure is truly needed within a worker self-directed nonprofit. There, specifically around like decision making, thinking about, there are so many decisions that in a traditional structure, you just kind of, as a worker of the nonprofit, you just kind of defer to the executive director or like higher management to make those decisions. When it comes to worker self-directed, you need to think about who is involved in all the decisions, and a lot of that trust, and a lot of that general discussion of like, okay, cool, when we need to make a decision about hiring, or when we need to make a decision about anything else, who is involved in the decisions, and what is the system, like what is the process that we follow to make sure that the full team is involved, while still, having the ability to make decisions. And like that, every little decision that you make within a nonprofit needs to have some sort of process to follow, which is a lot more. And like, it's something that we come up against constantly, trying to come up with new policies and new things to follow, just because like this is just the process that needs to be created that didn't need to exist before, because it was just the executive director makes that decision.
Thanks, y'all. I'm hearing themes around like trust, unlearning, unlearning old patterns and dynamics, clarity, and agreements that we can all kind of abide by together. And I wanted to lift up this question from the chat because it feels related. Kate says, even with the intention of work direction, I've found that the dominance mindset continues to be unconsciously manifest. So what are some strategies that folks have used for checking those dynamics when they come up? And Kate says, I've watched many people stand by frozen while another person just seizes control. I can definitely relate to both freezing myself or seeing that happen in other contexts. I'm curious what folks think about that question and any strategies to sort of self-assess or group assess about whether dominance, or non-liberatory relationships to power are operating.
And I can just jump in and say, just naming it as what's happening has been really, really helpful. In our first year in our new model, I feel like we were all collectively like still operating from the old ways of thinking and didn't even really realize it, myself included for sure. And then I realized, oh, I'm deferring to positional power, even though technically decision making doesn't happen there. So just naming it and saying it to each other has helped us shift it.
I'm gonna hop in here. It's something that I talked about last week, and it sounds like it's something that I think a lot of us have. Um, and it is kind of the acknowledgement, kind of what Rachel just said, where the acknowledgement that worker self-directed doesn't mean that hierarchy just doesn't exist within the organization anymore. Like, it still exists. And a big part of what we call it internally is fluid hierarchy. I think what SCLC calls it is like hierarchy by role. It depending on what you call it, but like a lot of it comes with the trust in this people that you have in those roles to make decisions around those roles. So thinking about like if you are talking about grant making or like any kind of development, like we have a development director, we trust our development director to make those decisions. And if we come to like a like a standstill, we can defer to them to be like, all right, we'll trust your judgment because you are in this position and we trust you. But when it comes to other roles and other decisions, like there are people who hold those roles, hold those projects, and ultimately like we trust those people to make decisions for those projects. And obviously like everybody who wants to be a part of those discussions and like have wants to give input on those decisions has the ability to do so. But ultimately, it is the trust in each other to make decisions where it's like where it makes sense.
Yeah, I also think in my experience, like normalizing feedback allows
Mhm.
for responsiveness when these like freeze moments happen. I know at the Commons we do, and it's a lot. Every other month we have, is that true? Yeah, about either every other month or quarterly, we do individual feedback. We do an annual 360 that includes all staff and folks outside of our staff container. And we hold a covenant where ideally we're touching in monthly on what are the principles and values that's the one, in all honesty, we still struggle with getting into a rhythm of being like, okay, how are we tending to the way in which we're moving in a values aligned way? But in normalizing feedback in the rhythms, in those moments where it feels like power is moving in a different way, you can respond with a lot more, as Ramiro was saying, trust, versus having to be like, oh, this is the first time we're engaging in any kind of conflict in feedback. What do I do?
Love it, love it, love it. Like normalizing conflict is like such a hard thing to do. And you know, more practice, it gets lighter, but it's all there's always going to be that, or I've always felt that tension, and I've seen others like at our organization. And I remember that was like a surprising thing when I entered the worker co-op community in the United States, working at Sustainable Economies Law Center, was how many worker owners were like, "Oh no, like healthy communications, nonviolent communications is like a lifelong process. It's not something that we like go to a training and then it's done." So yeah, that's and then the piece, Ramiro, that you were talking to about power, like always, or hierarchy always existing, is something I think that it's difficult for a lot of people to figure out how to navigate that. It takes time. There's a deep, like there's a big learning curve there. And part of it's like trying to find the balance between how to it's basically just hierarchy that you're consenting to, and so I like that fluid hierarchy kind of terminology. And why, again and again, I keep going back to this article that was written by Joe Freeman in the 70s called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. And it was talking about how in collective spaces in the women's liberation movement, people would say, oh, there's no leaders here. And we're not like, there's no leader. So don't say that I'm like a leader. We're all here together collectively running this. And then these hierarchies would emerge that you couldn't even talk about. And so for us, it's like, how do we learn from that? And so like explicitly acknowledging where power exists, and like defining that, and then allowing yourselves to revisit those relationships and those dynamics. I mean, when I started at the Law Center, we were 5 people, or actually 4. And now we're 17. Is that right, Sue? Are we 17 people or staff members at the Law Center now? So it's like with every new person, power dynamic shift, culture shift. 18. Thank you, Sue. And so it is like this perennial thing that we're having to navigate. So yeah, so those are, I think they're all really important pieces to continue to come back to. And Yanni, that is so awesome that you have so much, those feedback loops are really essential. So yeah.
Thanks, everyone. I feel like this is a good dovetail into another question. And I also want to lift up a question from the chat. So I'm going to throw 2 questions at you that are sort of related, and feel free to respond in whatever way feels alive for you. But I think we're kind of talking about this a little bit. You know, we started by talking about like, what is this movement teaching us about what we need as a movement? Trust, accountability, you know, structure. And that now I'm curious to hear a little bit more about like, what have you learned about yourself in the process of leaning into collective governance in your organization? And as we've been saying, like, this is not easy. This stuff is hard. So why does it feel worth it to actually to continue to work through these challenges and, you know, opportunities for growth in your workplace? So that's one question I want to throw at you. And I really appreciate this question from Ian in the chat about how we can make space for more working class voices and neurodiverse voices within the nonprofit industrial complex, which does strongly privilege the archetype of the nonprofit professional. And I think for many of us, what we're learning about ourselves is some unconditioning of our own class educational race conditioning. And so to me, I think those questions can be related to each other, and I wanted to offer them both and hear whatever responses folks have as we circle around those.
I'll just get us started on this one. That last question is one where I continue to have difficulty with it. I mean, there's some like specific things that we do at the law center. You know, I'm an attorney because because California, the structure of the policies and laws in California allows you to become an attorney without going to law school. So like I would have never gotten into law school, but I was able to apprentice under an attorney for multiple years. It's supposed to be 4 years. It took me 8. And so, but I became an attorney, and so that allowed me to go that path. And so we intentionally at the law center find people who are interested in becoming attorneys who would otherwise not be able to go to law school, who are involved in movement work, to come in and work with us and do the apprenticeship program at the law center, so that they can continue to do movement work while they're getting this tool. And so like that's a specific thing that we do. There's lots of other ways that we integrate, or we try to integrate, like I think what the question is getting to around neurodivergence and working class voices and marginalized groups, because a lot of the different aspects of our organization are collectively developed. And so through that, a lot of people get to decide both the process and the outcomes. I'll stop there for right now and see if other folks have other specific things, and then I'll maybe share a little bit more.
Keeping it easy for you all. I actually will step out of my host role for a second just to share a little bit of reflections. Before I was at Selk, I was at a not formally worker self-directed nonprofit, but a worker self-governed organization that when I started, there were 10 folks. When I left, there were over 50, and over 70% of the staff were returning residents and system impacted folks from San Quentin. So that was a big part of our, and so it just had a very different like class and educational culture than any other professionalized nonprofit space that I've been in. And I also come from working class background and have a lot of educational privilege. So I've like crossed class categories in my lifetime, and I find the resource activist class cultures by Class Action really useful. I think that there's so much that we may not even recognize about how we communicate, how we're in relationship to each other, that are related to class cultures. And I invited folks who weren't from working class backgrounds in my organization to kind of check that out in this previous organization, check that out and explore that. And we were able to have a lot of like meaningful, frank conversations about, it wasn't necessarily directly about class, because even that in itself is kind of a movement like paradigm. Like a lot of my working class colleagues weren't like, let's sit around and talk about our class conditioning. But they were like, let's talk about what's real in our lives right now, or let's talk about what's happening in my neighborhood that's having an impact on my ability to show up to work. Let's talk about what's happening in my family and community. And we were able to like be in those conversations together. So maybe echoing what Rachel said about surfacing what's happening, naming it, making it visible, and then like educating, being in conversation about it in many different ways can be a very important initial step, especially in a group that doesn't start off as class diverse. Thanks for sharing that in the chat, Sue. And also, Sue, at any point, if you want to step in here as our tech support person, but share any thoughts yourself on this question, would love to hear from you too.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, I mean, bring this into a lot of the spaces that I've been in. Oops, I didn't mean to replace you all. You'll have to do us back, Nicole. I think for me, there's been a lot of unlearning, not just from my dominant positions, but also from my less empowered position as a working class woman in a room full of some overeducated folks. And yeah, that the work in nonprofits has also often been very professionalized. Although I've been in nonprofits long enough where I remember when we weren't so professionalized. Back in the day when you just had a good, you had a good fundraiser or you had a good event and you decided to be a group, and that's how you became a nonprofit. But yeah, so unlearning the things about my voice not mattering, and unlearning the things about it's not my job, it's not my position. I remember one of my favorite stories to tell is I was sitting around complaining like you do at work. I was fairly new at the law center, and I was complaining about something, and two of my coworkers turned to me and said, "Oh, it sounds like you need to make a proposal." And I was like, "Oh, right, because I can't just sit here and complain and expect somebody else to find the solution." Right. And that was like my big eye-opening awakening. I had lots of community experience in collective spaces, but it didn't translate to my workplace. I still had this idea of like, I can see what's wrong and you have to fix it, Mr. Boss or Mr. Department Head or Mr. Project Manager, instead of, oh, I see something's wrong and let's work together to fix it. So I'll say that that's been my biggest learning is the unlearning of I'm subjugated down here and those up there are the ones that are doing it wrong. Thanks for inviting me in, Nicole.
Thanks, Sue. Great to hear from you.
Yeah, I just want to plus one to what Sue was just sharing. I was just thinking about the question and like, what have I learned? What have we been learning? And it is that it's like, you're not in traffic, you are traffic. It's like, getting out of that us, them, and like just the power and like enticing sense of like what it means to complain, but like, oh wait, we're the ones to fix it. That is a huge transformation, really. And it sounds very simple, but it's really powerful.
I think one more piece I want to add is speaking particularly to like neurodivergence and how do we like build and hold organizational structures that both like honor and account for neurodivergence in our organizations. And I'm not going to lie, I feel like worker self-direction and democratized structures make explicit some of the like hidden knowledge that most hierarchical nonprofits hold. And so there's just like more clarity and accountability and space for different ways of thinking and being to be able to function together. And if anything, I feel like like something like a worker self-directed nonprofit and other democratized structures allow for more room and more voices to be in conversation versus like whoever can think in a particular way, that's who gets access to the room.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. It's to the first question that Nicole asked about like what have I learned about myself in this process of leaning into collective governance. Is just that all of these, like this type of structure makes really apparent excuse me, like the contradictions that we have to navigate. And so we have to decide, how do we respond to those contradictions? I see that like all the time in the worker co-op like world, where they're in that marketplace and those systems, and they're having to navigate those contradictions of capitalism and when it confronts them in that kind of business orientation. And then for us, it's like the nonprofit industrial complex. And so how are we confronting? And I think that if we can be honest and playful and imaginative and compassionate when we confront those, then we can really open up some spaces and bring more people in. The other like two things around this is that because I'm seeing some questions in here, or I saw that some people were like, oh, I'm new, I'm interested, we haven't started it yet, like those types of things. So just to name that, like, there are many versions of worker self-directed direction, you know, in the nonprofit space. And so it's for all of our organizations to figure out, like, okay, what works best with this formation, these group of people. And that there's some structures to like start with, but it's really like an evolving process. And then I guess, one last thing is just the importance of like creating relational spaces, because in conventional hierarchies, you can just defer to power and then you can bounce. Whereas in these spaces, when we're really building organizations and intentional communities that are based in values of like trust and vulnerability and honesty and accountability and transparency, those are nice words, and their spectrums of what those words mean. And so finding out where on that spectrum is useful and meaningful for the folks in that space is work. And so having like retreats and having just spaces where you're not making a decision, you're just opening a conversation, has been critical in my experience for us to figure out, okay, we're not going to make a decision about our salary. We are going to all sit down and talk about our relationship to money. What's our history to money? What are our family positions? Like, what are those experiences, and how are they informing our relationship to what this thing that we call salary and wage slavery and et cetera? And so, so those spaces have been really critical for building a type of culture that allows us to get to a place where then somebody can make a proposal, and it's not, it doesn't feel like an attack, or it doesn't feel like somebody's trying to take resources away, or it's, you know, whatever it is. So, so yeah, that's some of the things I've learned about myself and the process.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, thanks for naming some of those questions in the chat. There, I see there were a number of questions of like, it would be great to hear concrete examples, or can you tell me a little bit more about the kinds of roles and jobs and committees that you need for different processes? And also a question about, you know, when is the right time to start this process? Ramiro, I saw you wanted to respond to that question directly about when is the right time to try to start a process of either building or transitioning to a worker self-directed nonprofit. And then maybe we can give a couple minutes to just sort of flesh out a little bit more concretely what this looks like in practice. And also we'll remind folks about both the case studies and the first recording, which also have a lot of great, the first part of this two-part conversation, which also have a lot of great examples, but I feel like we can always hear more to really make it feel real and relatable. So I'll pass it over to you to start, Ramiro, on the question about transitions and when to do this.
Yeah. So like I said, plan transitioned last year, and we started that process in the summer of 2020. So it took us about a whole year to like lay the groundwork to make the jump. And I think the like two things that are necessary to make this kind of jump are, and this is like in the most basic sense, is like one, a staff that is willing and trusts each other enough to do so. I said this in the last session, but worker self-directed is not for everybody. It is not something that like any organization can just be like, we're worker self-directed now, have fun. Like it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of trust. So you need to have a staff that is willing, and then you need to have a board that is willing to allow you all to do so. And both of those sometimes take some time to align some stars. Because ultimately, when you transition to a worker self-directed, at least the way that Plan has done it, and I think in a lot of ways how it is done in a lot of organizations, is that the power all of it goes into the staff. That means that the board like hands away most of the power that they hold traditionally. For us, we have an entire board resolution that's like, we trust them, and we trust them to run the organization how they deem fit, and it makes the board, it creates like a really interesting dynamic with your board where your board is now there as kind of advisors and like support, but like not really decision makers in your organization any longer. So for us, we had the stars align where one Plan's board is it's very unique to us, and I think where our board is created predominantly around people who we like working with. So it's like our board is really like a lot of students or young people who are recent graduates, former Plan staff, uh, just general like members of our community that were like, hey, we like you and we think the work that you're doing is cool. Do you want to be on our board? And with that, we have a board that's like not fundraising, not doesn't need to do fundraising. So it's like our board is not a bunch of rich people who need to give us money, and we're not like and because of that, we're not like, you don't have that kind of commitment to them. And things like that. And also, both of our executive directors left at the same time to pursue different opportunities. Faye Cristoforo, who we spoke about earlier, was one of the former executive directors. They left because they've just been here for so long. And then also, our other executive director left to go pursue her PhD at Harvard. And when we had that decision, we're like, all right, do we want to hire 2 new executive directors, or do we want to transition into something else that we all feel comfortable holding? Do we feel comfortable holding this organization amongst ourselves? And the way that Plan had been running up to that point was a lot of this like collective decision making, a lot of this, the foundation for worker self-directed already existed within Plan, and it kind of created like a perfect opportunity for us to transition.
Wow, that's great, Ramiro. Thanks for sharing that. I can jump in on the like, when's the right time, in some, well, not with any answers, but just some hard-won lessons, I guess, of like, so at Justice Funders, within the same time frame, we became our own 501c3. We had been fiscally sponsored. We became a worker self-directed nonprofit. We moved to a shared leadership model. And we doubled in size. And we became fully remote. So just like eyes wide open on like how much change you're doing in any given time frame and what you can realistically metabolize as a group of folks to manage that change. So at one point we were like, oh, we really need a new strategic plan. It was like, nope, not now. We're still in the midst of refining how we live into being in this model. And we know that change is constant for sure. And it can take a real toll if you don't give it the time and space to, things just take longer on the process wise. It takes a while to build the relationships, especially with the doubling in staff and being remote, right? That's next level in terms of relationship building and trust building. So if folks are considering this, really coming at a time when you don't foresee a whole lot of other things. I mean, for us, like we didn't know we were going to need to become our own 501c3 in that moment. It just sort of like all got rolled up into the same time. But yeah, we had to be kind of gentle with ourselves in that way. And then a little bit of catch up, because we kind of like, we thought we knew what we were signing up for. And then like a year in, it's sort of like, oh, we kind of didn't even know the questions to ask yet. So then we had to do a whole other round of, which we're still in, on like, oh, we chose this structure for a staff of 8, but now we're 18. It needs to look different. It's going to feel different. And then we also just have to get a lot more precise about how it works, because we didn't know. We had like the scaffolding, and now we get to the more clarity. So like most things you plan, like just assume it's going to take 2 to 3 times the amount of that than what you think it's going to do. And so, yeah, eyes wide open. Oh, thanks. And yeah, Dana's throwing some stuff in the chat for some more info on all that.
Thanks, y'all. Yeah, and hearing that, Rachel, like you chose this for a staff of 8 and now you're a staff of 18, and how do the structures need to change? I'd love to hear from maybe just one or two of you, a couple of different examples. Like, just give us like a 3-minute sort of overview of the kinds of structures you have. And I think, as Ricardo said, you know, there is no one blueprint for how worker self-direction happens, and each organization really creates the structure that's the best fit for the relationships and the people and the work and the mission. And so it would be cool to hear a little bit from a couple people just to flesh it out for some folks.
Not to put you on the spot, but Ricardo, we mimicked Selk in a lot of it. So would love if you're willing to kick it off, and then I could jump in to be like, and here's what we've added for like our weird structure.
Yeah, and embrace the weirdness. I also know that it's like the hour, so if people got to drop off, this is a reminder that this is being recorded and it'll be sent out. Is that right, Nicole? Okay, sweet. So yes, we are structured in circles, and so the sort of biggest circle that holds everything is the general circle, and then there's subcircles in that sort of organize our work. And one of the things that we did with our policy is that there's only certain decisions that could be made at the general circle, and then when we create a new circle, we delegate power and authority to a specific aspect or area of work to that space. And so as when I started, when there was 4 of us, and then very soon after, 5, and then I think we were around like 8 for a while. Being at a general circle meeting was like fine. Like what we found is like dinner table sized meetings is like optimal for making decisions and having conversations and things. When it gets bigger than that, it's like you're gonna have to change some things or figure something out. And so what we did was, as the general circle grew to now 18, we decided we're going to create, and that meeting was happening, I think, twice a month. We decided we're going to create this thing called the Stewardship Committee, and we're going to delegate some power to this committee, and that committee is going to be rotating from staff. And so that was another discussion of like, should it be elected? Should it be like people representing certain parts of the organization? We're just like, let's go super, super old school, like 2,500 years ago when in Greece, political positions were literally rotating through the citizenship, and like they defined what citizenship is. So that's what our stewardship committee is, and so we delegated decision making and authority. And so that's one version of how we've iterated like our structure to accommodate the different size and people in our organization. So yeah, I'll stop there, and then Yanni, if you want to share your version of the weirdness, go for it.
I don't actually have too much to add. I'm like, y'all iterated while we were iterating in our little corner. I think one of the adaptations for us, because we serve such a broad base of different kinds of organizations, our general circle includes some of those organizations. Like we were like, we can't come in here and make decisions without having the groups that we're serving be active decision makers. So we've identified what are the lanes that are fiscally sponsored groups, some of the folks who are involved with our offerings, like what decisions do they hold that are different than what for us like used to be general circle and is now our coordinating circle. What decisions do they make? Let me think, what else is different? Yeah, and I think because our offerings are like the closest thing, the programs that we have, they have their own circles and structures within them, so that every program and team has their own decision-making structures and authorities, so that it can be clear to like track. Okay, what decision was made when? Trying to think if there's anything else. I'll pause there. Curious, Rachel and Ramiro, what y'all got?
Yeah, I could jump in. And yeah, I also wanted Selk to go first because we were just reading everything from Selk when we were joining or like figuring this out. And I think like the dinner table size is so resonant because I actually read somewhere recently that like you can only have up to 6 people at a dinner table that will stay in one conversation. And so yeah, so what I wanted to share is like as we created our circles and then as we grew, our circles got really big. And we had like maybe too large of a scope of what we thought we were going to be able to do in those circles. And so then we got really inefficient and then it's like, oh, the structure isn't working. So what we're trying to do in real time right now is to make the circles smaller. So really that like 3 or 4 people as opposed to 6 to 10 people, and have a smaller scope such that there's less task switching, and more just true delegation of like, okay, this circle is responsible for setting this strategy. Also just naming a place where we've been learning and growing is like that strategy is happening in circles, but that's distinct from implementation. That we're still, and then it's like, oh, well, can we afford to hire all of the like implementation roles? And so still sorting that out as well.
I like that. For me, it's really fun. So, like everyone else, we also just kind of took what Selk has done some really great work, guys. So we also took what Selk did, and then we kind of iterated and created something for ourselves. Um, so a lot of the circle structures are very similar. So we have our general circle, which is everybody. We have our admin circle, which is voted upon, term limited members that kind of handle the like big stuff. So what I think someone was talking about, how do you all decide like hiring, firing, stuff like that, handed within the admin circle, and like they're also budgeting. That's mine. That's what I hold. What I want to talk about more is like outside of circles, we also the like sub layer of circles is committees, which is like kind of getting into committees hold a lot of the decision making power within our organization. So like if there's a big decision that we want to make, it gets delegated off into a committee, and then that committee uh, can bring people from all the different circles. It's just people who want to be involved, and then that committee then brings it back to the general circle. So for example, I am in charge of the budget committee. Our budget committee is open to anybody and everybody on staff that can come see how the budget is used, what's being spent, etc. But like there are core members to that committee that are the people who hold the biggest aspects of the budget. And any kind of like big budget decisions, big budget discussions are had in the budget committee, and then an update is given to the general circle. And that's not us like, and those decisions like that committee is made of people from different circles, etc. So it's you get the it gets granular, you keep building. You're like, we have to make decisions. Let's figure out who wants to be in this part.
I'm just gonna like pick up because thank you all for the shout outs to Selk. I remember when I came on, like I was the normie. I was like working with a bunch of geniuses, just like super creative, hyper intelligent. And then they're like, we need somebody to put on our public programming and education. And they're like, okay. And they met me, and then I was like hired. And so what was it? And I remember one of the things, this is like to the unlearning piece, was like, I think part of it is class, some like class consciousness, whatever thing, some racialized internalization thing, where they were just like, thanks, Nicole, and saying I'm creative too. But where I'm just like watching my 3 and then 4 coworkers like over the course of the first few years when we were creating all these structures, they were just like, hey, do we want to try it this way? Yeah, let's try it this way. Okay. And I'm just like, wait, what? Like we can just like we're just going to shift. There was some like risk aversion, but also something where I'm like, I need to talk to smart people before we decide anything. And they were just like, no, we got this. Like, and so there was like a lot of unlearning I was doing there, and then like stepping into becoming more creative because I was in a space where people were like, had that a privilege already and had already learned that. And so that was something. And then the second thing around all the circle conversation, I remember at the beginning when they were only like five, yeah, try it out was the like mantra for a long time. Thanks, Sue, for naming that in the chat. But like at the beginning with our circles, there was like five of us and we had like 9 or 12 circles. And so when we would talk about all of these circles that we had created, and from the outside, it looks like and you have an organizational chart and there's circles and, you know, they do all these things. They're like, how many people are there? And there's like, oh, that's 5. You know, we're just like on all of these different circles. So, yeah, just to name that. So you can, but try it out, like play with it, and then it was one of these things also where it allowed us to really like take apart professionalized, rigid roles or like positions in other organizations and just be like, okay, this position typically does this. Let's like disaggregate it. And then like 2 or 3 people can do all of these different things. And then we can swap them if a new person comes in. Or I remember a couple of times when we hired people, we would just be like, what are things that you would like to shed? And then we like make a list and say, okay, this new person can like kind of choose from this menu some things that they want to do. And so that you don't have to do it anymore. But it wasn't a thing where we're like, you have to do this, and now you're the new person that has to do grunt work or something like that. So, you know, try it out. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks everyone for bringing it to life for us a little bit, and showing really the diversity and the creativity and the like kind of continuous innovation that can be possible within worker self-directed. When we're in charge and we can try it out and be playful and change things that aren't working. We are coming close to the end of our time. I just as a heads up, I want to throw one more hard question at you all, because this one feels like the one that I really want movement spaces to be talking about. And then I want to open it up to anyone in the audience. So if you're the kind of person that's sitting on a question, but you're feeling a little shy and you need to work up the ability to come off mic, I'm going to warn you now so that you have that opportunity in a little bit, and would love to hear voices from other folks here. But yeah, my last question for you all is this is in response somewhat to what you were sharing, Yanni, about how you've innovated your structure to include the people who are actually most impacted by what you're offering in the decision-making structure in the organization. And I fear that there are many movement organizations that are so focused on governing ourselves internally that we're losing track of our movement goals and whether or not we're actually winning power externally. And I think the intention of if we're not prepared to govern, we're not prepared to win is like to win a more beautiful world we know is possible, we actually have to achieve governing power at a large scale, not just within our rad collective of like 9 QT BIPOC folks who all share like the same brand of leftist politics. Like we actually need to be able to govern on much broader scales, and we're getting so focused on what's happening internally. And that's not easy, as we've talked about, even though it's transformative and beautiful, it's not always easy, and it can require a lot of energy. And so how are we keeping sight of what are our broader movement goals, and how are we building accountability to those movements, or bringing, folks into the decision-making structures, even if they're not professionalized staff in the organizations? Those are some of the questions that I'm really sitting with, and I want us as a movement to be sitting with, and I'd love to hear any reflections you all have on those.
Oh, dang, Nicole. That is such an important question. And, I think there's just like so many competing priorities and contradictions in this, because it's like we all came in, it's like, yeah, if we actually want to bring about the world that we want, we have to practice it ourselves, and how important that is. And at the same time, like I'm very much feeling the pressures of like, we've got we've got these beautiful values aligned policies and a culture of care that include like great sabbaticals and time off and, which thank goodness, I'm so grateful. And then we have like the pressures of resourcing the work. And then we have the work, the external work that is what we're here for. Plus then the pressure of the time needed to just use this model, especially when we're new at it and it hasn't like really landed yet. And to be honest, like none of those things, it's not all adding up to something that feels like it's easy or clear or working in this moment. We're still really new at it. But like if I look at, we keep very detailed like time projections and time tracking, and I looked at my hours for this fiscal year, and like the amount of hours on the internal stuff was very, very significant. And so it's like eyes wide open around how much time it takes, but then also at what point do you need a little bit of a rebalancing on like, what does the world need from me and from justice funders in this moment? And yeah, that's a tension that I really have no answers on, just lots and lots of questions. So super excited to see. Maybe if my esteemed colleagues on the call have some answers, bring it on.
I'll talk about this it's to something that I talked about earlier, which was like the structure of our board. Plans board is comprised of our stakeholders and the people that we want our work to like impact the most. So it is like majority just like QT BIPOC. It is like majority like students, young people, because it is people who we want, who we work with, who we want to work with, and who we like. Honestly, it's just kind of vibes on our board more than anything. And it is this structure, this model has allowed us to do that a lot more. We this past year have expanded our board from like 9 to 18 people, because there are like less decisions that our board needs to make in this structure. It gives us the opportunity to just kind of bring in people to the board, and also because Plan does not have a funding board, or a fundraising board. Our board does not need to worry about raising money for us, thankfully. Um, that allows us to like bring in a lot of people to represent and show a bunch of random communities that we want to work with, and it gives us the opportunity to like hear from them and make sure that they have say in how our organization is being run, to the extent that our board has, and that's been a really fun opportunity within this, like that has been granted to us through this structure.
Yeah, I'll chime in with two like examples of how within our organization we're trying not to use not to can't find a better word, to not just focus on the like navel gazing of like we need to fix our structure and everything will be better. So I think one concrete piece, we very intentionally have created this like set of offerings to movement organizations, and there was a point where we budgeted a pool of funds to like experiment with what other offerings are needed out there. And our little team came up with like a list of 7 really great things. And we're looking at the budget and we're like, who the hell do we think we are? Like, sure, we've been on the ground, but are we like, we're just going to serve our own little dreams of what we think matters? That doesn't make any sense. So we made that process completely external. Like, whoever had ideas and like potential inklings of what an experiment could look like, we collected so much data. We then took it to the groups who we're serving to be like, what do y'all actually need? And how do we prioritize that? Because again, in our own structure, we're setting the strategy. So we could decide, we think this is worthwhile. But by saying there are parts of the strategy that we can anchor in our wisdom, but most of the strategy needs to come from the people who are on the ground doing the work. I think the experiments that we're trying out right now are going to benefit so many more organizations and collectives than the initial list. Some of them were overlapping, which was great, means we were like on the pulse of something. but I want to say half weren't. So it like really speaks to how do you balance like democratizing internally amongst the wisdom that's in the room and democratizing externally and bringing the voices in. I had another example and it totally lost it, so I'm going to pause there.
I mean, there's something where this is a difficult question. Because there's something where I'm like, okay, is this about like seizing state power? Is that what we're talking about? Or is it about like affecting systems that are larger than us? And if it's more the second one, then I can more easily be like, oh no, yeah, this system, like worker self-direction, at least in my experience, has allowed us to be more radical and push in directions that if we were a conventional nonprofit, we wouldn't. We just wouldn't have done that. And so, I mean, like one thing that we do is we do participatory budgeting at the organization, and then what was it? And when we have a surplus of money that we've raised for our organization, we a lot of times give it away to other organizations that don't have access to resources like we do. At a conventional organization, like I don't see conventional nonprofits doing that, like as an example of, and it's that it doesn't even, yeah. So I'll just leave that out there. But there's, and if we're talking about affecting culture, I mean, Selk, lots of people have been impacted by the like creativity that Selk has done, so if it's, and like whoops, maybe it was a mistake, but I agree with like Rachel, like I think it's too soon to say, and I think there's been a lot of positive impacts. The like third thing is I think there's something where this model or just democratic models in general on a local scale push people to challenge themselves in different ways, and I think like having tools and resources around to help us navigate those challenges is really important, and that it responds to something in our movements where I think a lot of times we rightfully so like respond to inequities at a like with systemic responses with and just like bypassing our own internalized oppressions. And so this model allows us to do both of those things simultaneously, and it does take time to so yeah, so that's how I'll respond to that. The state power question is one that's still floating out there for me, but I think in a few years we'll see the impact of democratic or like nonprofits in that space as well. So
That'll be our next webinar, seizing state power. Thank you all so much. That was really, I feel really buoyed by a lot of the answers that you had to share. I know we just have a few minutes left, but I did want to open it up. If there's anyone here who has a question they'd love to bring to the panelists. Meanwhile, Sue is gonna drop in the chat a few links if you're interested in learning more from other worker self-directed nonprofits like the ones in the room. The Nonprofit Democracy Network is a great community of practice, and there's an application to join there. And we'll also be running a 9-month training program. This is kind of our flagship program, and so there's an interest form if you want to express interest in joining the training program. The program is called Collaborate to Co-Liberate, so there's the interest form. As I said, we'll capture all these resources in the chat. We'll share the recording and the resources as a follow-up. And I do want to open it up for anyone who wants to come off mic and step into the room and bring any remaining questions that you have.
Yeah, I will, if that's all right. So I an important person in my family is is staff at large public sector union here in California, and like that work is so important for them. It is like such a calling, and that's one thing that they really share with the feeling of that calling to serve the common good is a lot, among the like rank and file of the staff. it's, they have so much in common with the members, with the member base. We have conversations a lot about how, like, the staff, the working staff, the salaried staff, who luckily, and the decent thing about working for a labor union is that you tend to have staff unions that they can belong to, which has been super beneficial. Um, compare, all things considered, has earned them a lot of good contracts. But anyway, it's like, it seems like they have a lot more in common with the kind of rank and file members of the union than they do with, and in my opinion, with both kind of the electeds, higher member electeds, and also with the kind of executives of, in the executive directorate. So I don't know, when it comes to an organization that has like that, it seems like the membership base would be, could be, if they were educated enough about workers' self-direction and those kind of angles. I don't know. It's just wild. I feel wild speculating about like an organization with like 200 staff transitioning. Any thoughts on that? Like, it just seems like there's so much promise there also for our labor union to, like, live up to its principles. So anyway, thank you for the conversation.
Thanks, Paul. Can I pass that to you, Ricardo? Just knowing the intersections between, don't have to have all the answers, but Ricardo has also been, there is a growing overlap among unionized worker self-directed nonprofits, which is not exactly the question that you're asking. It's still sort of the nonprofit sector, but, and there are lots of examples of very collectively run, very large scale cooperatives, Mondragon and others being classic examples, hundreds and thousands of people. So they're not necessarily nonprofits, but I think there are growing examples in the sector that we can turn to as the worker movement, the worker power movement and labor movement, and this movement to sort of dismantle the nonprofit industrial complex within movement organizations continues to intersect.
Okay, so yes, there's examples of scale. I don't know, and I think Sue probably could maybe find those. I think we've done some studying about larger worker self-directed organizations at the hundreds and scale type of thing. And then to the union, I think it, like, for us at Selk, we're even having internal conversations of like, what is the purpose of our labor work, and what is the purpose of democratizing workplaces? It's to give workers power. And so if we can, if unions can play that role, but if the organization is not ready or willing to the things that Romero was bringing up earlier around like board structures and existing power dynamics, that like those could be options as well, and like bringing in a union, because that's also participating in a different type of democratic practice, but still a democratic practice by the workers to say like, we have power and we're going to exercise it. And so I think there's going to be a lot of different strategies for people to take if the purpose is to build working class power, both culturally and materially and emotionally. So I'll just say that because I know we're running out of time.
Thank you, Ricardo. And thank you so much. Welcome everyone, to give a round of applause for our panelists and for everyone in the room. It's been really enlivening to be in this conversation together, and may it continue. May we continue to grapple with these questions as a movement. May we support each other in our growth and learning from each other's examples and being inspired. And may this work just continue to deepen and build the more beautiful world that we all believe is possible. And that's why we're here. So thanks everyone for being here. Bows of appreciation to each of you on the stage here, and till next time, take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, y'all.
That's such a great conversation.
Hmm?
That was fun.
Yeah.
Yay, thanks everyone. Okay, let me pause the recording.